Welcome back to Sewing with Sir Mari. Today we're going to learn how to use a bias strip to bind the edge of your fabric. You can see here that this bias strip is cut 45 degrees to the grain line of the fabric. Here's the grain lines, and you can see here they're this direction, and the edge is 45 degrees to that. The advantage of using a bias strip versus a straight grain strip is that it has some stretch to it, and that allows us to manipulate the fabric around a curve or even around corners more efficiently. This is an example of a bound edge on a sleeve cuff. I used a velveteen so it gives good contrast and a nice textural difference to the sleeve that it binds. You can purchase bias tape already created and folded. This is a single wide bias tape. This is a double wide bias tape, and it's already, as I said, folded in, and you can see how it has been created. But ultimately, it is still just the width of the fabric cut on the bias to give it stretch. Often though, our color selection and our fabric selection is very limited, so it helps to know how to make your own. Learning how to make bias strips is not difficult, and there are a lot of tutorials out there. In this case, I have a bit of it that is out of a teal linen, and we're just going to put it onto a piece of scrap fabric for the purposes of our demonstration. I'm going to start with this about a foot width away. Ultimately, I want to look at this into quarters. This is 1.5 inches wide, and if you can see, I've done little folds just to indicate the halfway and the quarter points, but it doesn't have to be exact. So I'm going to put this a foot width away, which will give me a binding that is approximately this wide when I'm completed with it. I allow my bias strip to lay onto the edge of the garment that I'm making. I don't pull it at this stage, I just let it lay. And you can pin this in advance if you would like. And I'm putting this right sides together. So the right side of my bias tape is onto the right side of my fabric. Now I'm going to iron this down to make that nice and crisp, and then it will be folded over and sewn down on the other side. This has now been pressed into place and folded into quarters. So you can see here, this has been folded up. And on the other side, you can see that I have brought in this far edge to meet it here in the middle, and then it's going to be folded over to complete my binding. I can hand stitch this into place, and one of the ways that I can do that is by using a slip stitch, or if I don't mind my stitches showing more, I can use a whip stitch. To do a slip stitch, I have my thread go in between the fold of the fabric. I want as little as possible to show on the outside. I tuck my tail of my knot in. If I sew it right at the seam line here, then it is not going to show on the other side. And if I only catch a few little bits of the thread directly across from where I went in, I go back into the fabric. I travel along the inside of that fold. See? I catch a thread, very small bite out of my fabric, Again, I dive in almost where I came out, and I travel on the inside of the fabric again. That creates a stitch that you really can't see on either side of the fabric. I catch a thread, I travel on the inside, make sure I have no extra loops. So you can see that that practically disappears entirely and is not seen on the outside at all. Or, if I want to be a little less precise in what you can see, I can do a whip stitch. Again, I'm going to catch just a little bit so you don't see it on the outside. I'm going to go over the edge of my bias strip. And you can see that I have the little ticks taken out of the edge of my bias strip. So you do see it a little bit, as opposed to here where you don't see it at all. Now, if I do not want to do this all by hand, which, by the way, is the most precise way, and you're not going to see it on the other side, which is a bonus for those of us doing recreationist work and don't want to have machine sewings showing on the outside of our garments. But if that's all a little too tedious for you, you can learn how to do stitch in the ditch. Stitch in the ditch is a way of securing this side of the bias strip without having to hand sew it, but it does require a little bit of skill. First, you want to have this side of the bias strip be slightly wider than the other side so that it's coming down on this far side or the inside of the stitch line here. And again, you can pin this in place if you want. And I'm going to feel this with my fingers, and the goal is to sew in this ditch between where the bias tape is and my fabric is. And if I use a thread that's not black, that is matching the material of either my bias or my fashion fabric, then I can make certain that I go right into this ditch and those stitches will hardly show at all. I'm taking great care to feel with my fingers and to guide my fabric just so. And this is where that skill part of this comes into, because you don't want your outside, your underside, to come unfolded or to be too much or too little, because you don't want to miss catching that little bit across on the back of it. Thusly. You can see how well hidden that is as it stitches in the ditch. And on the back, you can see that it's fairly even along here, which I kept black so you could see it. I could also do my bobbin thread in the same teal, and then it would be hidden more on the back as well. Another option, if you don't care about how the top stitching looks, is that you can top stitch, which takes less talent than trying to stitch in the ditch. And I can come in just this side of the bias tape. So that I'm actually catching the bias tape as I sew, making my stitches visible. But it does require less skill. And if, for instance, I'm making 47 masks, I can continue my bias tape here, pushing it together and sewing along it. Creating a tie for a mask if that is what I was making. So you can see it's visible here on the outside versus my stitch in the ditch, which is pretty near invisible, versus my hand stitching, which isn't visible on the outside at all. My slip stitch, which is invisible on both sides. The whip stitch, which is visible on the back side as little notches. Stitch in the ditch is visible as a top stitch on the back side, and then the top stitching is visible on both sides. But I can continue on and create a tie if I was doing this as a mask or something like that that I needed the extra length for. So there you have it. That's how to do a bound edge, and it is useful in multiple situations. I hope you've enjoyed our video. Sew well.